Welcome to Seasilk Stories. Tonight, we'll leave the waking world behind and step into a place where candlelight flickers softly, old houses keep their secrets, and forgotten stories wait patiently to be told. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Whether you're tucked beneath warm blankets, relaxing after a long day, or listening to the rain somewhere across the world, leave a comment below and say hello. If these stories bring you a little peace at the end of the day, consider subscribing and joining us for more cozy evenings filled with Gothic folklore, fairy tales, ghostly legends, and timeless mysteries. Now, let the fire crackle softly beside you, settle into your favorite chair, and allow the world outside to grow wonderfully distant. Our story begins. The lighthouse that waited for the dead. The sea had a way of keeping what it loved. The villagers of Blackwater Point understood this better than most, for they lived on a narrow strip of coast where the cliffs rose black and wet above the tide, and where the fog came in so thick during autumn that even familiar windows looked like ghostly lanterns floating in the dark. The people there were practical in the way coastal people often are. But even the most practical among them spoke gently when they mentioned the ocean. They knew it gave fish, salt, wind, and work, but they also knew it took names from families and left empty chairs beside hearths. Above the village stood Blackwater Lighthouse, a tall stone tower built on the highest cliff, where gulls nested in spring and storms broke themselves against the rocks in winter. Its glass lantern room could be seen for miles when the light was burning, and sailors trusted it the way tired children trust a candle left glowing outside a bedroom door. The keeper of the lighthouse was a woman named Meredith Ashcombe. She had lived there alone for 15 years, though the word alone never seemed quite correct inside that old tower. The lighthouse was full of small living sounds. The wind moved through the shutters at night. The fire sighed softly in the grate. Rain ticked against the windows. The great lamp turned slowly above her, sending its golden beam across the water like a patient hand searching the darkness. Meredith kept a simple life. Each morning she polished the brass fittings until they shone warmly in the grey light, and each evening she climbed the spiral stairs to tend the lamp before the sea swallowed the last colour from the sky. She grew lavender and white roses beside the lighthouse wall, even though the village women said nothing gentle could survive so close to the salt wind. Meredith only smiled at that, because the roses bloomed every year. Long ago, before she became keeper of the light, Meredith had loved a man named Thomas. He had been a sailor aboard a merchant vessel called the Evening Star, a fine blue-hulled ship with a silver gull carved proudly at her bow. Thomas had promised to return before winter, and Meredith had believed him because love often makes promises sound stronger than weather. But winter came, and Thomas did not. By spring, the village had accepted what Meredith could not. The Evening Star had vanished somewhere beyond the northern reefs, and no wreckage had ever been found. For years, she walked to the harbour whenever sails appeared on the horizon, and for years she returned home with the same quiet face and the same unspoken disappointment folded carefully inside her. When the old lighthouse keeper retired, Meredith took his place. Some people thought it strange, but others understood. A lighthouse was a fitting home for someone who had spent half her life waiting. One autumn evening, when the air smelled of rain and cold iron, Meredith found an old ledger tucked inside a locked drawer beneath the lantern room desk. It contained notes from keepers who had served long before her time, and most of the entries concerned storms, repairs, and ships guided safely into harbour. Near the final pages, however, the handwriting changed. The ink was faded, and the words had been written with a care that suggested the keeper had feared being misunderstood. It spoke of a night that came once each year, always with the first true fog of autumn. On that night, the lost ships returned. The ledger did not call them ghosts. It called them vessels of remembrance, which she thought was both more beautiful and more sorrowful. The keeper's duty, according to the entry, was not to speak to those aboard, nor to follow them, nor to call out names into the fog. The duty was only to keep the light burning until dawn, so that whatever came in from the dark sea could find its way back again. Meredith read the entry twice, then closed the ledger and sat for a long time beside the turning lamp. She did not believe it, yet she placed the ledger back in the drawer with unusual tenderness, as if she had been handed a letter meant for someone else's grief. The fog came 3 nights later. It arrived before sunset, rolling in from the sea in great silver folds until the cliffs, the village, and even the sky seemed to dissolve. By the time Meredith climbed the tower, the world beyond the glass had become a blank whiteness softly lit by the fading day. She lit the lamp early and watched the beam sweep across the mist, steady and golden. That night, she made tea with lavender from her garden, wrapped herself in a wool shawl, and brought a book of old fairy tales into the lantern room. The fire below had been banked for the evening, and the tower held a comforting warmth that made the storm outside feel far away. She read for nearly an hour, though her eyes returned again and again to the fog pressing against the glass. Sometime after midnight, the air changed. At first, she noticed only the silence. The sea, which usually breathed and muttered below the cliffs, had grown strangely still. Even the wind had withdrawn. She lowered her book and listened, and after several long moments, she heard a bell ring somewhere out in the fog. It was not loud, but it carried clearly through the tower. Another bell answered it farther away. Then a third bell sounded, low and solemn, followed by another and another, until the mist beyond the lantern room seemed filled with the soft calling of ships that had remembered the way home. Meredith rose carefully and stepped out onto the narrow balcony that circled the lighthouse. The cold fog touched her face at once, damp and delicate as lace. She held the railing and looked down toward the sea, where the lighthouse beam passed slowly over the whiteness. Shapes began to appear. At first they were no more than shadows, tall and uncertain. Then the fog thinned around them, and Meredith saw ships drifting silently across the black water. Their sails hung still, though there was no wind to carry them. Lanterns burned along their decks with a soft amber glow, and each vessel moved as smoothly as a swan across a pond. There were ships from many ages. Some were old wooden fishing boats with patched sails and weathered rails. Others were larger merchant vessels with high masts and dark polished hulls. A few looked so old that Meredith could not imagine what century had built them. Yet each ship seemed whole, preserved in the exact moment before the sea had taken it. Figures stood upon the decks. They did not call to her, they did not wave. They looked toward the lighthouse with faces quiet and pale in the turning beam, and she felt that they were not asking for rescue. The ships passed one by one beneath the cliff, and Meredith kept her hands wrapped around the iron railing as the lamp turned behind her. The sight should have frightened her, but it did not. Instead, it filled her with a sorrow. Then one final vessel emerged from the fog. At first, it seemed only another shape among many, but as it drifted into the lighthouse beam, Meredith recognized the blue-painted hull and the silver gull carved at the bow. She recognized the curve of the stern, the lanterns along the rail, and the pale sailcloth that had once vanished beyond the harbour mouth on an autumn morning 15 years before. The evening star had returned. She did not move. She could not have moved if the tower itself had begun to crumble beneath her feet. A man stood near the bow, with one hand resting lightly on the rail. He wore the same dark coat he had worn the morning he left, and the fog stirred gently around him as if the sea had kept even the shape of his absence intact. When he lifted his face toward the lighthouse, Meredith saw Thomas exactly as she had carried him in memory, neither aged nor changed, with kind eyes and a sadness that felt almost like peace. For a moment, the distance between them seemed very small. Meredith pressed one hand against her heart, because she understood then why the old ledger had given its warning. If she called his name, she might ask him to stay. If she asked him to stay, she might forget that some doors open only so love can look through them once before closing again. Thomas smiled, and the smile was so tender that all the years of waiting seemed to loosen inside her. He raised his hand, not as a plea and not as a farewell, but as a greeting across the impossible distance between the living and the dead. She raised her hand in return. The lighthouse lamp continued turning behind her, warm and faithful. Its beams swept over the decks, over the faces, over the fog, and over Thomas standing quietly at the bow of the ship that had taken him and kept him and returned him only for this one night. When the first pale line of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, the ships turned back toward the open sea. No sail shifted, and no command was spoken. One by one, they drifted into the mist, their lanterns fading until they looked like stars sinking into water. The evening star was the last to leave. Thomas remained at the bow until the fog folded around him. Meredith stood on the balcony long after he vanished, her shawl damp with mist and her cheeks wet with tears. When the bells stopped ringing, the ordinary sound of waves returned below the cliffs, and the world became itself again. By morning, the sea looked empty. The village woke to gull cries, wet roofs, and smoke rising from chimneys. No one knew what Meredith had seen, and she did not tell them. She only went down to her garden, cut 3 white roses, and placed them in a small glass jar beside the lantern room window. After that year, Meredith kept the lighthouse with a different kind of tenderness. She polished the glass more carefully. She tended the roses with greater devotion. Each autumn, when the first fog gathered at the horizon, she filled the tower with firelight, lavender tea, and fresh flowers. The villagers noticed that the lighthouse glowed especially warmly on that night, but they considered it one of her private habits and respected it as such. Many years passed, and Meredith grew old in the tower. Her hair silvered, her hands became slower, her face changed in the way all beloved faces change when time has lived gently upon them. Yet every autumn, no matter how tired she became, she climbed the stairs to keep the lamp burning through the fog. When her final winter came, she was found peacefully asleep in the chair beside the hearth, with a book of fairy tales resting open in her lap, and the scent of dried lavender in the room. The village mourned her sincerely. They buried her on the hill overlooking the sea, close enough that the lighthouse beam passed over her grave each night like a blessing. The new keeper was a young man named Samuel Reed, who had grown up hearing stories about Meredith, but had never believed in anything that could not be mended with tools or explained by weather. On his first autumn at Blackwater Point, the old fisherman gave him only one piece of advice. They told him to keep the light burning until dawn when the first fog came. Samuel laughed politely, as young men often do when old men offer warnings wrapped in legend. Yet when the fog arrived that night and the bells began ringing softly across the sea, he did not laugh for long. From the balcony of the lighthouse he watched the lost ships emerge from the mist. He saw their lanterns glowing and their silent passengers standing upon the decks. He saw vessels that no harbour had welcomed for generations. And standing beside the lantern room window, as calm and familiar as firelight, he saw Meredith Ashcombe. She looked younger than she had at the end of her life, though not quite young. She looked like herself at every age, gathered into one gentle presence. She wore her dark dress, and a white rose was pinned near her heart. Her gaze was fixed on the sea, where the evening star drifted last among the returning ships. Samuel said nothing. He understood without being told that the lighthouse had not lost its keeper. Even now, sailors who pass Blackwater Point on the first foggy night of autumn sometimes claim they see two lights shining from the tower. One is the great lamp that guides the living away from the rocks. The other is softer, warmer, and visible only through the deepest fog. The villagers say it belongs to Meredith, who keeps her faithful watch beside the sea. They say she lights the way not only for ships that are searching for harbour, but also for souls returning briefly through the mist to remember the places and people they loved. And if the night is very still, and the fog is silver enough, one may hear the distant ringing of ship bells across the water, while high above the cliffs the lighthouse burns steadily on, waiting with patient fire for the dead. The Mirror Parlour. Hartwell Manor stood at the end of a narrow winter road, where the trees grew black against the snow, and the wind moved through their bare branches with the softness of whispered conversation. By daylight, the house looked tired rather than frightening. Its roof sagged slightly beneath frost, its stone steps had cracked from many hard seasons, and ivy clung to the walls in dark, sleeping veins. Yet when evening came, and the windows caught the last violet light of the sky, Hartwell Manor seemed to remember itself. Its long glass panes glowed faintly, its chimneys rose like watchful figures, and the whole house took on the strange beauty of something waiting politely to be noticed again. Clarabelle arrived there on the first snow of December. She had been invited by Mrs. Hartwell, an elderly widow who still lived in the East Wing with 2 servants, 3 cats, and more rooms than any one person could reasonably need. Clara had not come for pleasure, she had come to rest. After a year of disappointments, funerals and letters that had brought more sorrow than comfort, she had accepted Mrs. Hartwell's invitation because she could not bear another winter in the city, where every street lamp seemed to shine on someone else's happiness. Hartwell Manor welcomed her with candlelight. The entrance hall smelled faintly of beeswax, cedar, old books, and smoke from the kitchen fire. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner with deep, patient certainty, while a carpet faded by generations stretched toward a staircase wide enough for women in silk gowns and men in evening coats. Mrs. Hartwell greeted Clara with both hands extended as though she had been expected not for days, but for years. "You must be frozen from the road," the old woman said warmly. "Come inside at once, my dear, and let the house remember what it is to have a guest." Clara smiled at the unusual phrase, but she felt too tired to question it. She allowed herself to be led into the drawing room, where a fire burned behind a brass screen and tea waited on a low table beside a plate of honey cakes. For the first time in months, she felt some small part of herself begin to loosen. It was after supper that she discovered the mirror parlour. Mrs. Hartwell had gone upstairs early, and Clara, who had never slept well in strange houses, wandered quietly through the ground floor with a candle in her hand. She passed a music room with a covered piano, a library smelling of leather and dust, and a conservatory where frost had silvered the glass roof. At the far end of a corridor, she found a pair of dark wooden doors carved with roses, ivy, and tiny crescent moons. The doors opened without a sound. Inside was an oval parlour unlike any room Clara had ever seen. The walls were covered with antique mirrors of every shape and size. Some were narrow and tall, some round as moons, and some framed in tarnished gold or carved black wood. A marble fireplace stood at one end of the room, unlit but freshly swept. and velvet chairs waited in a graceful half-circle as though guests had only just stepped away. Clara lifted her candle. Every mirror reflected her standing alone in the doorway. Then, very slowly, the reflections changed. The room inside the glass filled with light. Not the cold light of Clara's candle, but the warm glow of oil lamps and a great fire burning brightly in the hearth. The chairs were uncovered, the walls freshly papered, and holly garlands hung above the mantel. A family moved through the reflections as naturally as if Clara were looking through windows into another evening. There was a father reading a newspaper beside the fire, a mother arranging embroidery threads in a basket, two boys playing quietly with wooden soldiers on the rug, and a girl of perhaps 8 years old sitting near the window with a doll in her lap. A maid entered carrying a tray of tea. Somewhere beyond the glass, someone laughed. Clara stood very still. The family did not notice her, at least not at first. She returned the next evening after dinner, telling herself that curiosity was stronger than fear. The mirror parlour was cold when she entered, but the mirrors warmed almost at once, filling again with the winter evening from a century before. The same family appeared, not repeating the exact scene, but continuing their lives as though time inside the glass moved according to its own quiet calendar. For several nights, Clara watched them. She learned their habits. The father, Mr. Hartwell, read aloud from the newspaper and occasionally removed his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief. The mother, gentle and composed, embroidered flowers onto linen while listening more closely than she appeared to. The two boys, Henry and Arthur, were forever being told not to run indoors. The little girl, Beatrice, often sat nearest the largest mirror and brushed her doll's hair with great seriousness. It was Beatrice who first noticed Clara. One snowy evening, while Clara sat in the real parlour wrapped in a shawl, Beatrice looked up from her doll and turned her head toward the glass. Her gaze moved past the reflected furniture, past the lamplight, and settled directly upon Clara's face. Clara's breath caught, though she remained silent. Beatrice did not scream or point. She only studied Clara with the calm curiosity children often reserve for birds on windowsills. After a moment, she lifted one small hand and waved. Clara, after a long hesitation, waved back. The following evening, the maid noticed her, then Henry, then Mrs. Hartwell of the glass, who paused while pouring tea and looked toward Clara with a startled softness that quickly became interest. Within a week, every member of the reflected household seemed aware that someone sat beyond the mirrors watching them from another winter. The strange thing was that Clara no longer felt like an intruder. The family did not appear frightened by her. They looked at her kindly, even expectantly, as though she were a guest who had arrived by an unusual entrance. Sometimes Beatrice brought her doll to the mirror and held it up for Clara to admire. Sometimes Arthur made exaggerated bows that made Henry laugh. Once, Mrs. Hartwell of the past placed a teacup near the mirror's edge, and Clara felt such a sudden ache of longing that she nearly wept. It was not the tea she wanted, it was the invitation. On Christmas Eve, snow fell so thickly that Hartwell Manor disappeared from the world. The windows were white with it, and the corridors held that deep hush that comes only when a house is wrapped completely in winter. Mrs. Hartwell had gone to bed early after pressing Clara's hand and telling her that old houses were kinder than people believed, provided one listened properly. Clara went to the mirror parlour just before midnight. The room was warm when she entered, though the real fireplace was unlit. Every mirror shone brightly. Inside the reflections, the Hartwell family had gathered for Christmas. Candles burned along the mantel, ribbons hung from the chandeliers, and a small tree stood near the window, decorated with paper stars and sugared fruit. Yet something was different. An extra chair had been placed beside the fire. It was empty. The family stood around it quietly, waiting. Beatrice came closest to the glass. Her face was solemn but not sad. Behind her, Mrs. Hartwell smiled with such tenderness that Clara felt suddenly less like a watcher and more like someone who had been missed. Then the old grandmother, a woman Clara had seen only once or twice in the reflections, rose from her chair and approached the mirror with careful dignity. Her silver hair was pinned beneath a lace cap, and firelight softened every line of her face. When she spoke, Clara heard her as clearly as if they stood in the same room. "You have spent many evenings in our parlour, my dear," the grandmother said. "Would you like to warm yourself by the fire?" The glass did not break, it did not ripple, nothing dramatic happened at all. The mirror simply became, for one gentle moment, less like a barrier and more like an open doorway. Clara stepped forward. The warmth met her first. It smelled of pine, oranges, candle wax, and wool drying near the hearth. Beatrice took her hand with perfect trust and led her toward the empty chair. The family greeted her not with astonishment, but with the gracious ease of people welcoming a long-expected guest. Clara sat beside the fire. Someone placed a cup of tea in her hands. Henry offered her a sugared almond from a paper cone. Mr. Hartwell asked whether the snow was still heavy outside, and Clara answered him as calmly as if speaking with people from a neighbouring village rather than a century past. For 1 hour, perhaps 2, she remained with them. She listened to stories. She laughed softly when Arthur forgot the words to a carol. She watched Beatrice fall asleep against her mother's skirt. She felt, for the first time in a very long while, included in the simple warmth of a room where no one required her to be cheerful, useful, or healed. When the clock struck 2, the grandmother touched Clara's shoulder. "You must return before morning," she said gently. "The living have their own fires to tend." Clara did not want to leave, but she understood. She rose, thanked them, and stepped back through the mirror into the cold parlour of her own time, carrying with her the scent of pine and the warmth of tea. After that night, Clara no longer felt alone at Hartwell Manor. She spent the rest of winter there. Each evening she visited the mirror parlour, and sometimes the family noticed her, and sometimes they did not. She understood that the mirrors did not belong entirely to either world. They opened when kindness allowed it, and closed when memory needed rest. By spring, Clara returned to the city changed in ways she could not easily explain. She wrote more letters. She accepted more invitations. She began keeping fresh flowers on her table, even in winter. Yet every December, when snow began falling, she returned to Hartwell Manor. Years passed, Mrs. Hartwell died peacefully, and Clara inherited the manor, not because she was family by blood, but because, as the old woman wrote in her will, "The house has chosen her, and houses are rarely mistaken." Clara restored the mirror parlour with great care. She lit the fire every evening, polished the glass with lavender water, and kept an extra chair beside the hearth. Travellers sometimes came to the manor during snowstorms, and those who were lonely, grieving, or simply tired of the world were invited after supper into the oval room with the antique mirrors. Not everyone saw the family. Those who did were never quite the same afterward. A widower saw his wife seated by the fire, younger and smiling. A young man who believed no one had ever loved him saw the Hartwell family turn toward him with such immediate welcome that he cried openly into his hands. Clara never explained the room. She only poured tea and let the mirrors offer whatever comfort they could. When Clara herself grew old, she often sat beside the fire with a book open on her lap, reading aloud to both the living and the dead. In the mirrors, Beatrice remained forever 8, Arthur forever mischievous, Henry forever patient, and Mrs. Hartwell forever graceful beneath the lamplight. Yet somehow Clara did not feel they were trapped. They seemed preserved, as music is preserved when someone remembers how to play it. One winter evening many years later, Clara fell asleep in the mirror parlour while snow pressed softly against the windows. The fire was low, the room smelled of roses and smoke, and in the nearest mirror Beatrice sat with her doll, watching over her. By morning, Clara was gone. The villagers buried her in the small cemetery behind the manor, beneath a yew tree that held snow beautifully on its branches. For a while, the house stood quiet. Then, on the first snowy evening of the following December, a traveller lost his way on the northern road and saw warm light shining through the trees. He knocked at the door of Hartwell Manor, and a gracious woman with silver hair welcomed him inside. She gave him tea, took his wet coat, and led him to a firelit parlour filled with antique mirrors. In the reflections, a Victorian family gathered beside the hearth. There was a father with a newspaper, a mother with embroidery, 2 boys on the rug, and a little girl holding a doll. Beside them, in a green velvet chair, sat Clara Bell with a book open in her lap. When the traveller looked closer, Clara raised her eyes from the page and smiled directly at him. The fire burned warmly. Snow covered the world outside. The mirrors glowed with the gentle light of another century, and Hartwell Manor, which had waited so long to be seen, opened its quiet heart once more.